Welcome to week 4 of ENVU 3150, Environmental Decision Making. This is the week 4 lecture, and we're going to continue with our discussion of descriptive models, and we're going to talk a little bit about biases in decisions. Descriptive models are models that describe how people actually make decisions, so they're more based in reality. And this week we're going to look at 5 biases that occur in decision making due to distortions in our processes around decision making, our perceptual processes. We're going to look at the optimism bias, the evaluability bias, following the herd bias, the spotlight effect, and then the discounting or present bias. A decision bias is a pattern of distortion in perception, interpretation, analysis, and judgment. In fact, these are the 4 core elements of any decision process. We perceive reality, we interpret that reality, we analyze it according to a set of criteria and values, and then we make a judgment about that reality. And we act then on that particular judgment. Each of these particular elements is subject to distortion. The way in which we perceive things can be distorted based on the context, the way in which we interpret them based on our experience and our values, the way we analyze them based on the criteria that we use, the way we structure our hierarchy of values, and the way we make a judgment. Is it a final judgment, or are we open to suggestion? And so these 4 elements all have various types of distortions, and they add up in the end to a bias that affects a decision outcome. Now, there are several hundred decision biases that have been identified. In this particular class, we're just going to look at the ones that are relevant for environmental decisions. However, if you come up with one you think is relevant for an environmental decision, please introduce it, explain it, and then show how it's relevant. I'm certainly open to new ideas, and that would be something that would add a lot of value to the learning in the class. The optimism bias is a belief that a person is less at risk of experiencing a negative event compared to other people. So we believe that we are not at risk of experiencing a negative event when we compare ourselves with other people. And one of the examples of this is the Garrison Keillor in the Lake Wobegon, where all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all the children are above average. This is a statement of the optimism bias. The optimism bias is especially important in environmental decisions, especially those decisions around climate change. When the climate has been stable for a long period of time, we tend to be optimistic that the past will be, or the future will be the same as the past. Past will continue. So we are optimistic. We're less at risk of experiencing a negative event compared to our experience in the past. And so we don't take necessary preventive steps to protect ourselves from probable harm. This is a very common bias among people. It occurs in lots of different contexts. Decisions around driving, decisions around eating. In fact, it occurs in almost every part of our life. But in the environmental arena, this is very important because the environmental decisions tend to be very complex, and the optimism bias will push us in a direction that may not necessarily result in the best outcome. The evaluability bias is when we use easy to evaluate characteristics and ignore or avoid more difficult to evaluate characteristics about a particular situation or an item or something that's going on. When we lack adequate information, we need a comparative framework with a reference point, and this enables us to make a meaningful comparison. If we don't have a framework, we don't have a reference point, we will tend to reduce our decision to 1 or 2 characteristics that are easy to evaluate, and again, the availability heuristic might kick in. But the evaluability bias is the bias towards using just one, perhaps, or two characteristics that we can bring to bear and compare the alternatives. We see here one of the applications in to reduce the evaluability bias is nutrition information. We can see here that the nutritional value of bone chalk is 0.80. Nutritional value of all sorts of chocolate is 1.36. And so what this does is this reduces the evaluability bias. When we look at nutrition information just on a standalone basis, it's hard to compare this with other alternatives. And so having the scale at the bottom shows us that we are able to look at two points, and these points are relevant. What we do is, the example, say, of a chocolate bar, or perhaps other food items, when we don't have a lot of information or a comparative framework, we'll make a decision comparing maybe the labels or the pictures or other things rather than looking at complex information. And this occurs quite frequently. The evaluability bias is based on an experiment done by C in 1998. This is rather interesting. So if we look at the two ice creams that were shown to participants, one was a 10-ounce cup filled with 8 ounces of ice cream from vendor H, and then one was a 5-ounce cup filled with 7 ounces of ice cream. And so which of these two ice creams did the subjects prefer? Well, it depends on whether they saw a single ice cream or the two side by side. When the subjects looked at just the one from vendor H and just the one from vendor L, they were willing to pay $1.66 to vendor H and $2.26 to vendor L. However, subjects who saw both of them simultaneously were willing to pay $1.85 to vendor H and $1.56 to vendor L. So what we see is that we tend to evaluate alternatives based on easy to ascertain characteristics. In other words, the cup is overflowing, looks like it's worth more, therefore we will assume that it is worth more. So this is an interesting study because it shows us that the context of a decision must allow for comparative assessment in order to avoid this bias. Following the herd is another bias. This is a very common bias. Happens in large organizations, especially those with strong cultures. The following the herd bias is based on several factors. One is collective conservatism, which is a group's tendency to generate emotional attachment to past decisions. In-group bias, which is a preference and liking for members of one's group. Cronyism, which is a preference for friends and close acquaintances. Modeling, which is adapting the behaviors and attitudes of those perceived as admirable, which are most likely friends, close acquaintances, and members of one's group. And out-group bias, which is fear of outsiders and strangers. And so we tend to go along with group decisions and stifle our disagreements. And this is especially important around environmental decisions when other biases might be present and when we are confronting the existence of these other biases in other members of our group. We will tend to stifle our disagreements and stifle our insights and adopt the collective sort of group voluntary blindness towards the situation. The spotlight effect is when we overestimate the extent to which our actions and appearance are noted by others. This is based on something known as the self as target bias, which is the sense that actions or events are disproportionately directed towards ourselves. We tend to believe that social spotlight shines more brightly on us than it really does, and so we over-adjust our behaviors to conform to group norms. This is similar to the previous bias, conformity bias, and this amplifies that bias. In fact, it gives us a tendency to focus more on acceptance within our group than on self-directed behavior based on principles. And this has ethical ramifications as well as behavioral ramifications for decision makers. Discounting and present bias is actually ensconced in traditional economics. Discounting is part of finance. It's known as the time value of money. And what it is the tendency to value the present moment more than the future. And the bias is not understanding that what you want now may not be best for you in the longer term. In other words, the longer term outcome is what you should be looking at instead of your immediate wants. And this is what is known as a want-should conflict. The present bias leads us to tend to satisfy an immediate want rather than a future should, something that's best for us in the long term. It is short-circuited by what we want right now in the short term. We tend to prefer a short-term reward rather than delayed gratification. We can overcome this, but it takes some discipline. This is the psychology behind the candy in the checkout area of the market, and they do amazingly well with that based on our immediate wants in the checkout line, especially after we've been shopping for a while, looking at all that food, how hungry we are. The present bias causes procrastination because what we do is we continually opt for a sure thing now versus something that may not happen in the future. And so we keep putting it off, we make no decision about it. The political arena, especially decisions around climate change and around environmental technologies and energy policy are good examples of the present bias in action. What we do when we have a present bias is to focus on actions that can be planned in the short term. So we choose now, and our long-term plans become more diffuse or they become non-existent. And this, in countries where we have democracies, makes long-term planning especially difficult. The key to overcoming this bias is investing something that will result in a long-term good or long-term should. These are things such as buying Weight Watchers food, and you've got a commitment, you want to eat that food. Building a preserve, and this is the entire foundation of the Nature Conservancy, or installing solar panels on a particular facility. And so what we're doing is we are deliberately committing to the long-term benefit by investing now in investments in hardware, software, facilities, etc., or changing our resources around, such that the long-term results give us what we want. The long-term shoulds enable us to be better off in the long term, even though we may sacrifice some of our short-term pleasures. The long-term benefits ultimately will be greater than those realized than if we were to consider only a short-term focus and move through time based on our short-term wants. So in conclusion, our biases often operate subconsciously. These biases can be difficult to overcome even with awareness. It takes practice, and as we've seen, it takes commitment. And environmental decisions are increasingly subject to bias, especially as we live our lives in the built world, the human world, separate from the natural world. We tend to focus more on our immediate groups. We tend to be involved more with humans than with non-humans. We tend to be pandered to in the consumer society. We're constantly having our desire for wants reinforced, so the want-should conflict is made worse. We tend to be optimistic because the marketing is always optimistic about things, and it makes us feel good about what we're purchasing. And so these biases are becoming more and more relevant as society moves away from an agricultural society in contact with the natural world to a a society where we live mostly in cities. We're surrounded by buildings, and we tend not to be out in contact with other than human beings, and we tend to be rather isolated in our just in our human contact as well as our contact with the natural environment. So that takes care of the biases, and now the key is for you to begin to understand how to apply these based on your first paper that's due at the end of this week.